Imagine a massive, powerful empire. Its armies, feared across the known world. Its economy growing, fueled by advanced farming, complex trade. It controls huge territories,
Right.
seemingly at its absolute peak, historically strong. And then, poof, without some huge foreign invasion, it just crumbles,
Yeah.
collapses from the inside out.
It really is the ultimate historical paradox, isn't it? And maybe one of the most terrifying case studies in just systemic failure you can find.
Right.
Most nations, they perish because they get old, they get weak, maybe they're conquered by someone stronger. Think about the Western Roman Empire, that sort of slow, painful decline.
Yeah, it's a classic story.
But what happens when an empire dies at, like, age 30? When it's vigorous, wealthy, still looks dominant from the outside.
That's the puzzle. That's the core thing we're diving into today. This spectacular, honestly counterintuitive collapse of the Han Dynasty. And we're going to ignore the usual noise, the court gossip, the emperors who weren't up to snuff, the minor border fights.
Right, the distraction.
Our mission here is to really dissect the structural failure, the super cancer, as you called it, that just devoured this empire from within.
Exactly.
And want to reveal how fiscal policy, how local strongmen turned the most powerful state on the continent into, well, an empty shell.
We absolutely have to look past that superficial drama, but focus on the cold, hard, almost mathematical mechanism of destruction.
Yeah.
Because the true source of the collapse, the real engine, was the rise of this integrated, powerful class, landlords, local tyrants, who basically weaponize the state's own systems, especially its tax policy, against the very foundation of the state itself.
Okay, let's start with a quote. It's from the philosopher, historian Wang Fuji, and it should really give anyone thinking about governance pause.
Which one is that?
He said, "Nations usually perish due to weakness, but only the Han perished in its strength."
Ah, yes. That quote is absolutely critical because it just immediately forces you to discard the standard, decline narrative.
No.
When Rome fell, it was largely, well, centuries of external pressures, right? Compounded by internal politics, economic stagnation. They were literally pushed over by Germanic tribes breaking through a weakened perimeter.
The barbarians at the gates.
Right. But the Han Dynasty, fundamentally different. They weren't conquered. They disintegrated internally. They consumed themselves.
That distinction is huge. It implies the core operating system, the state itself, failed.
Yeah.
Even while the visible signs of power, the size, the army's reputation, they seemed intact, masking this internal rot.
It's like finding out a, perfectly fit marathon runner suddenly suffers catastrophic organ failure because their body just stopped absorbing nutrients, started attacking its own cells. It's that kind of internal backdown.
It's terrifying.
Precisely. And having that historical clarity, it lets us quickly set aside the three commonly cited causes, the ones that are ultimately insufficient.
The usual suspect.
Yeah. We acknowledge the political instability. Incompetent emperors, sure. The power grabs by imperial consorts and their families, yep, that happened. Even the famous peasant uprising, the Huangjin, the Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Right, we hear about the Yellow Turbans all the time.
We do. But we're not saying these things didn't happen. We're just reframing them. They're symptoms. They're not the critical disease itself.
Okay.
They were the visible failures that basically signaled the underlying structural breakdown had already gone critical.
So, like, the fever breaking after the infection has already taken hold.
Exactly. And that reframing, it's most necessary when we talk about the Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Okay.
We often hear that this massive uprising of landless refugees brought the dynasty down. And look, yes, those desperate, displaced people, they were a devastating force, no question.
A huge factor, you can't deny it.
Right.
But like you said, they were only one side of a very sharp coin.
Right. If you have a massive refugee crisis, tens of thousands, then millions of displaced, starving, landless people forming armies, you have to ask the basic question.
Who's creating them? Or what is creating them?
Exactly. The Huangjin were the effect. They weren't the primary underlying cause.
So what was?
The cause, the systemic destructive force, was the very group creating the refugees, the powerful landlords and local tyrants.
Wow.
These were the cancer cells. They systematically hollowed out the state's revenue, its political control, long before the peasants picked up pitchforks.
Let's define this group clearly then, because it wasn't just like the rich people. It was something new, something integrated and scary.
It was. We're talking about a massive politically and economically unified elite, a real concentration. This group included princes, nobles, high-ranking officials, ministers,
Like
governors.
establishment.
Yeah, and imperial in-laws, very important. But also, crucially, these highly placed, often slave-owning merchants who had successfully bought their way into the landowning gentry.
Wow, so they merged different kinds of power.
Completely. So if you're trying to get your head around it with a modern analogy,
Yeah.
it's tough, but you almost have to combine several untouchable figures into one.
Okay, try me.
You're talking about a group that holds the kind of land ownership you'd see in a medieval feudal lord, right?
You're right.
Totally self-sufficient on their private estate.
You're right, the manor.
Plus, they have the political immunity, the influence of the highest cabinet ministers, maybe judges, untouchable legally.
Okay.
And then add the raw liquid wealth, the market manipulation ability of a modern industrial tycoon or, an oil baron.
So land, political power, and massive cash and market control.
Oh.
All in one package.
It was a hybrid monster, really unique in the Han's history. They owned staggering amounts of land, wielded privileges that got them out of most state taxes.
Ah, the tax angle again?
Always. And they held the political power to just veto or neutralize any official policies that might hurt their bottom line.
Of course.
And critically, they also maintained their own private armies, recruited right from their manors, often better paid, better equipped than the actual imperial forces.
They weren't just the elite. They were, as you put it, warlords in waiting.
That's it. They had achieved functional independence from the state and their rise. It was a direct, almost accidental consequence of the state's own attempts at, believe it or not, efficiency.
Okay, that's wild. Which brings us straight into the economic foundation they built this power on, this fiscal disaster. This is where it gets really fascinating and kind of infuriating. How did the central government, which you'd think wanted to strengthen the empire, inadvertently just hand the keys to the whole economy over to these local guys?
Right.
You're saying the root cause goes way back to an early Han fiscal decision,
Yeah.
shifting to poll taxes.
Yeah, we have to understand the bind the early Han were in. They inherit this huge, newly unified territory. Now, to accurately tax land across that vast space, you need a massive decentralized bureaucracy, people who can survey, measure, track every single plot.
That sounds expensive and complicated.
Extremely. That level of administrative competence, it just didn't exist yet, or it was way too expensive to set up and maintain over those distances.
Okay, so they took a shortcut.
Basically, they opted for administrative convenience. Instead of taxing the land hard to measure, they taxed the people. Poll taxes, heads, easy to count.
Simple, low overhead.
Yep.
Seems logical.
Simple, yes, but catastrophic in its unintended consequence, because the state was mostly collecting revenue by counting heads.
They didn't focus on land tax.
Exactly. They let the land tax rate drop to almost nothing. Officially, sometimes it was only 1/30th of the output. But in practice, for the powerful, the privileged classes, often waived entirely. Zero.
Okay, here it is. The crucial insight. If you eliminate or drastically minimize the tax on land, the main store of wealth in a farming society, what have you just created?
The perfect risk-free asset. The holding cost for owning land, basically zero.
Which creates this massive, irresistible incentive for
Wealth consolidation. For the wealthy officials, the gentry, the merchants, the ones who already had liquid capital land, became this incredible investment. It guaranteed output, needed minimal upkeep, and crucially, had zero tax risks.
So they just started buying.
They poured their money into buying up huge tracts. And it wasn't always friendly buying either. They often exploited smallholders through debt or use outright political coercion to just seize their farms.
And this wasn't just like a free market thing. This was state-tolerated, state-induced even.
Totally state-induced.
Yep.
The powerful elite used their political privileges not just to buy the land, but also to hide how much they actually owned, dodging even the tiny remaining taxes.
Wow.
Let's try to visualize this. A modern context might help. Imagine if, say, the U.S. government suddenly just abolished all property taxes.
All of them. Federal, state, local, gone.
Gone. For good. Now, that's a massive sudden windfall for anyone holding real estate.
Huge. Especially the big players.
Exactly. But wait. To compensate for that lost revenue, the government institutes a flat, mandatory, let's call it a $5,000 survival fee.
A fee.
Yeah. Every single citizen, doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, what your income is, you owe $5,000 a year just for existing.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The hyper-wealthy, our Han gentry equivalent, they'd instantly consolidate all the stable real estate. $5,000. Trivial to them. But the land, now generating wealth completely tax-free.
Meanwhile, the small farmer.
The smallholder, yeah. Facing that mandatory fee they absolutely cannot afford. They're forced to sell their land, their only asset, to the wealthy elite, maybe just to pay the state's fee?
It's a system perfectly designed for maximum wealth accumulation by the powerful.
At the direct expense of the state, which gets less overall revenue, and the farmer, who loses everything.
That perfectly explains the land grab. But you mentioned a second flaw. The poll tax system created something else disastrous through the monetary fiscal system.
Yes, the monetary system aspect. Another decision made for efficiency. The Han administration decided to collect most taxes, especially those poll taxes, in currency.
Well,
in coins, not in kind, like grain or cloth.
Okay, getting paid in cash sounds more modern, more efficient.
It seems advanced, yeah.
Yeah.
But it created this unparalleled opportunity for financial predation. It put people in a terrible double bind.
Okay, walk us through that bind. Start with the farmer.
All right. The farmer's overall tax burden is already heavy. Now, they have to pay a big chunk of it in coins. Cold, hard cash.
But farmers don't usually have a lot of cash lying around.
Exactly. Farmers are cash poor. Their wealth is in their harvest, their animals, their labor. They don't generate coins easily.
So what do they do when the tax collector comes demanding coins?
They become forced sellers. They often have to dump their harvested grain or whatever onto the local market at fire sale prices, usually right before the tax deadline when everyone else is selling too. So supply is high and prices are rock bottom.
Just to get the currency they need.
Right. And if they couldn't sell fast enough or the price was too low, they had to borrow. And guess who they borrowed from?
Let me guess. The same wealthy elite.
At exorbitant predatory interest rates, of course.
So this just crushes the farmer, forces prices down for what they produce, impoverishes them further.
Exactly. It creates this deflationary pressure on the producer. Now flip it. Look at the government side. The state has collected mountains of currency, coins, but the army can't eat coins.
Right. Soldiers need food.
And infrastructure projects need materials like timber or iron. The government still needs massive supplies of actual goods, grain, cloth, iron tools.
So the government, having taken everyone's cash,
Yeah.
now has to go back into the market.
They become a forced buyer. They have to re-enter the market they just sucked cash out of and buy back the very goods they need, like grain.
Okay, I see the trap. This creates a huge need for middlemen, right?
Oh, perfect middleman trap. This whole scenario practically screams for large merchants with massive liquid capital to step in.
To manage the flow.
Yeah, but here's the twist. In an economy without, like, modern industrial capacity or flexible production, what's the main way for these middlemen to make enormous profits?
Controlling the supply. Hoarding.
Speculation, hoarding,
Uh-huh.
high-volume, coordinated market manipulation, jacking up the prices when the government needs to buy.
And who had the liquid capital, the political cover, and the connections to run these massive speculative operations?
Our integrated elite again? Merchants colluding with powerful nobles and officials. They were perfectly positioned.
So they controlled the whole cycle.
Total control over the cash flow, over the commodity supply chain. Let's go back to that analogy, make it more Han specific. The government demands taxes in Bitcoin, right? Currency.
Okay.
The farmer sells all their corn for pennies on the dollar to the powerful landlord merchant. He's the only guy locally with a Bitcoin wallet, effectively.
Got it.
6 months later, the government needs grain. To feed the legions up on the northern border, they take their collected Bitcoin back to the market. But who controls all the stored corn?
The same landlord guy.
The same powerful landlord, who now sells the government its own grain back to them, but at grossly inflated prices, using the government's own Bitcoin.
That's just brilliant and evil.
It's a dual mechanism for blood draining. They exploit the farmer on the selling side by demanding currency they don't have, and they exploit the state on the buying side by monopolizing the commodities the state needs.
And the state effectively paid for its own collapse by setting up a tax system that only benefited the super rich.
Who are already mostly exempt from the main tax burden anyway, the land tax. It's almost perfectly designed for failure.
Okay, but if the state was getting so drained, so desperate for funds, why didn't they try to, I don't know, crack down on the market manipulation?
Oh.
Or just print more money to help the farmers?
Good questions. But the lack of real institutional capacity and that deep integration of the elite made both those options basically impossible.
How so?
Well, printing more currency, huge risk of massive inflation. That would only hurt the poor and maybe soldiers on fixed salaries even more. Who holds the real assets? The land, the grain, the landlords? Inflation doesn't hurt them as much. It might even help them consolidate more debt-ridden land.
Okay, so printing money is out. What about regulation? Price controls?
Regulation. Think about it. Who would enforce it? Any local official tasked with regulating prices or market fairness was either part of that landlord class or was put in office by the landlord class.
Ah, no unbiased enforcement mechanism left.
None. The economic cancer had already metastasized deep into the bureaucracy itself. The system couldn't police itself, so we've got the economic engine of this thing figured out, right? Zero-cost land hoarding, monopoly control over cash and goods.
Yeah, a disaster in the making.
But wealth alone, even massive wealth, doesn't automatically destroy an empire. You need political power to institutionalize that wealth, protect it, make sure it lasts for generations.
Right, you need to lock it in.
Which brings us to the political systems that basically cemented the landlord's control, made it permanent.
So how did the government's own method for picking leaders become, a weapon aimed at itself?
It was essentially baked into the law, a legal, institutionalized barrier to entry for anyone not already rich.
How did that work?
Early Han law, the system designed, ironically, to bring talent into government, it flat out stipulated that candidates for official posts had to possess huge family assets.
Huge? Like how huge?
We're talking prerequisites initially exceeding 100,000 coins. It got adjusted later, but still required significant stable wealth.
Okay, 100,000 coins. Put that in perspective for me. What does that actually mean?
It means generational wealth. Stable, landed wealth, usually. To give you a comparison, a regional governor, a very senior official, might earn an annual salary equivalent to less than 20,000 coins.
Wait, so you needed assets worth 5 times the yearly salary of a top official just to be eligible to even apply for a government job?
Pretty much, maybe even just a lower-level job to start. So the pool of potential political talent, automatically restricted to the already wealthy. The doors were closed to almost everyone else.
That's not just a hurdle, that's a foundational flaw. It basically creates a constitutional oligarchy from the get-go. Access to power is tied directly to inherited or acquired wealth.
Yeah.
Forget upward mobility for ordinary folks, no matter how smart or capable they were.
Exactly. And while the early Han leaders did try initially to keep merchants and industrialists out of office, maybe they sensed the danger of purely commercial interests running the state.
A little bit of foresight there.
Perhaps. But that restriction was basically a joke. Why? Because if a merchant got wealthy enough, what could they do?
Use their cash to buy land, since land was so cheap to hold tax-wise.
Bingo. They buy land, transform themselves legally into a landlord, and presto, they meet the asset requirement, they qualify for office.
So the loophole was big enough to drive a merchant caravan through.
Absolutely. And eventually, that law restricting merchants was abolished entirely, which just formalized the integration we talked about. Money, land, and political power all merging.
Okay, let's try another modern parallel here. This sounds like writing into the Constitution today that only, say, accredited investors with a proven net worth over $1 million, or maybe people who own over 100 acres of farmland, are allowed to run for Congress.
That's a pretty good analogy. It fundamentally guarantees that the political machine will always, always prioritize protecting private wealth, protecting existing assets over things like public good or social mobility.
Because the only people in the machine are the ones benefiting from that protection.
The cycle just reinforces itself. Wealth concentrates education. Remember, education was a scarce, expensive resource in the hands of these elite families.
Right. Only the rich could afford tutors, books.
Education then provides access to the bureaucracy, to official positions. Holding office gives you the political authority to protect your family's land holdings, maybe bend some rules, facilitate those market manipulations we talked about.
And then pass that advantage down.
Generation after generation. Which brings us to this absolutely crucial concept, multi-identity integration.
Okay, what does that mean specifically?
It wasn't just that the rich influenced politics from the outside, like lobbying. It was that the rich, the political elite, the scholarly class, the people who defined morality and knowledge, and the big commercial players were literally the same people, often within the same extended family, passing this combined power down.
They weren't separate groups competing for influence. They were the influence.
Yeah. They were an unbeatable, self-perpetuating oligarchy because they controlled every single lever of social power at the same time. They weren't fighting separate battles for economic or political or cultural dominance. They had merged all the institutions into one closed system.
Okay, give me an example. Make it concrete.
We see this perfectly, almost chillingly, in the case of Zhang Yu, a senior official during the Western Han.
Zhang Yu. Okay, what about him?
Well, he wasn't just a political figure who climbed the ladder and became prime minister, the top job in the bureaucracy.
Which is already huge.
It is, but he was so much more. Zhang Yu was, simultaneously, a massive landowner who had built his family's fortune through commerce and buying up land.
Okay, rich guy, check. Top politician, check.
He was also a powerful political operator behind the scenes, and crucially, get this, he was a revered Confucian scholar, the guy who compiled and dictated the standard orthodox interpretation of the Analect.
Wait, the Analects? Like the foundational moral and political text for the entire empire?
Yeah, the very same. He literally wrote the official study guide, the version everyone had to learn.
Hold on, so this one guy holds the highest political office, controls enormous economic assets through land and trade, and also dictates the moral and philosophical framework by which every other official, every scholar is judged.
You got it.
Yeah.
He defines the law through his political power. He controls the finance through his wealth. He monopolizes the real economy through his land. And he dictates orthodoxy through his scholarship.
How do you even begin to challenge someone like that? Where's the check? Where's the balance?
There isn't one. That's the point. There's no external leverage left.
Yeah.
If the system of critique itself, the scholarly tradition, the moral framework is controlled by the very person you need to critique.
The state has been completely captured.
Totally captured. The integrated elite defined the rules of the game, they owned all the pieces on the board, and they served as the referee, judge, and jury. The state itself, the idea of public authority, just became subservient to this unified, self-serving class.
But hang on. The Han Dynasty lasted for centuries. If the system was this fundamentally rigged, this broken, how did it manage to hold together for so long before the final, implosion?
That's a fair question. Initially, in the early days, the dynasty kind of needed powerful local support to consolidate the empire after unification. Building that massive bureaucratic infrastructure we talked about, prohibitively expensive.
So they relied on local bigwigs.
To some extent, yeah. Relying on powerful local families who could administer justice locally, collect some revenue, keep order. It was maybe a necessary evil at first.
Right.
But over time, that necessary evil metastasized into the dominant parasite. The sheer inertia of tradition plus the immense wealth that had accumulated now locked in by these political selection rules just made this integrated group too powerful to dislodge.
Without a massive upheaval.
Without a revolution, basically. Which no emperor comfortable in the palace really wanted to risk. They kicked the can down the road until the road ran out. So, okay, we've mapped the mechanisms, right? The zero-cost land investment creating massive estates. The cash flow monopoly draining both farmers and the state. And the political integration locking this elite in power.
Yeah, the trifecta of doom.
And the combination of these things, it led directly to the complete erosion of the national foundation, both economic and political. This is where we really see that concept manifest, guobi jia feng.
Remind us what that means.
The state weakens while families prosper.
Chilling. And it captures the really terrifying nature of this collapse because the state didn't necessarily look impoverished from the outside, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, overall economic output, farming output was actually pretty high during this period.
It was, remarkably so. The Han Dynasty saw significant technological progress, better iron farm tools, moldboard plows, more intensive farming methods, large-scale water conservancy projects, canals, irrigation.
So the total size of the economic pie was actually growing.
Yes, which is why the paradox perished in its strength is so striking and so important.
So why doesn't that growth translate into national strength, into state revenue? Where did it all go?
Because the growth was completely captured. It was concentrated and protected within the private sphere. Those advancements, the expensive new tools, the localized water systems that required investment, they were deployed almost exclusively inside the massive private manors controlled by those powerful landlords.
So the benefits of innovation, the increased yields.
Siphoned entirely into the private sector, far, far outside the reach of the imperial tax collector, locked away.
We need to really understand what these manors were. You said they weren't just big farms. It sounded more like miniature autonomous states.
They absolutely were. The historical accounts, they paint a vivid picture. These places were massive. They encompassed entire self-sufficient communities. They had their own granaries, huge ones, fish ponds, workshops for tools and crafts, extensive livestock operations, pigs, chickens, cattle, everything needed to sustain themselves.
Self-contained economies.
Totally. And crucially, they were physically protected. Landlords built actual fortifications. We're talking moats, watchtowers, strong walls made of rammed earth or brick. These weren't just estates. They were military outposts as much as agricultural centers.
And inside those walls, the landlord was basically king.
Pretty much. They functioned with extra legal authority. They judged disputes among their tenants, their dependents, often using their own internal rules or codes. They completely bypassed the jurisdiction of the official, court-appointed local magistrate.
Wow.
And, as we mentioned, they maintained substantial private armies, recruited from their huge pool of tenants, maybe some slaves, landless refugees looking for protection and food, and these private forces. Often better supplied, better trained, and definitely better paid and more loyal than the central government's own troops stationed nearby.
The fiscal consequences of that are just devastating to think about. If all the empire's real productive wealth is locked up inside these fortified, effectively tax-exempt private states.
The imperial treasury runs dry. Simple as that. The state becomes fiscally anorexic. It's starving itself to death in the middle of what looks like plenty.
So the central government is broke.
The fiscal collapse became total. There are accounts of the emperor literally lacking the funds to pay the critical border troops, the guys guarding against incursions on the frontiers.
What happens then?
They mutiny, or they just desert. They abandon their posts. Meanwhile, essential public works, the big canal systems needed for transport and irrigation, the flood control projects that protected huge agricultural areas, they fall into disrepair because there's no money for maintenance.
Which probably creates more disasters, more refugees.
Exactly. It exacerbates local environmental problems, drives even more farmers off their now unprotected land, right into the arms of the big landlords looking for cheap labor for their manors. The state loses the fundamental ability to maintain infrastructure, provide relief, or even just keep basic social order.
So it's the perfect, terrible reflection of Guobi Jiafeng. The central government is crumbling, the emperor can't pay his guards, they're probably ineffective anyway. Yet 100 miles away, the local tyrant has stronger walls than the capital city and a private army that's the best fighting force in the whole province.
The wealth has gone entirely private. It's been siphoned off.
And this leads directly to the political erosion, right? It's not just about money anymore.
No, the political decay mirrors the economic decay. When these powerful landlords seized effective imperial power, not necessarily by becoming emperor, but by controlling the bureaucracy and local administration, they did more than just, check the emperor's power.
What did they do?
They converted public authority, the legitimate right to govern, to judge, to maintain common order for everyone, into private control, used purely for their own self-interest and enrichment.
Okay, but we often hear arguments, even today, about the need to decentralize power, to have checks and balances against a strong central state. What's the fundamental flaw in arguing that this powerful landlord class simply provided a necessary check on potential imperial overreach? Why wasn't it a good thing, in a way?
The flaw is that weakening the emperor in this specific context didn't empower the people or create better governance. It meant undermining the only unified mechanism for public authority that existed across the whole empire.
So it wasn't decentralization, it was.
It was privatization of governance, or maybe fragmentation is a better word. At the local level, remember, the official representative of the state, the magistrate, the governor appointed by the court, they became mere figureheads, puppets.
Often chosen by the local landlords.
Often selected from or installed by the dominant, local, powerful landlord families themselves.
So what does that mean for an ordinary person? Like a small farmer gets cheated out of his land, or his family gets attacked.
Who do they turn to for justice? The official government representative. That person is the landlord who cheated them, or his brother, or his appointee. There's no recourse.
Society just descends into a kind of local anarchy.
Anarchy that harms only the ordinary citizen. The powerful are above the law because they are the law locally.
The whole system just seized up. It became sclerotic.
Utterly. Now, of course, the threat wasn't totally invisible. People at the time, some rulers, recognized the danger. There were attempts at reform.
Like what?
Well, you see figures like Wang Mang. He actually came from one of these powerful elite families himself, interestingly. He briefly usurped the throne and tried to implement really radical fiscal measures.
Yeah, couldn't things.
State monopolies on key goods like salt and iron to recapture revenue, attempts at land redistribution, breaking up the huge estates, even slave emancipation, trying to free up labor.
Those sound revolutionary. Seriously radical for the time. Why didn't they work? Why were they not only ineffective, but actually ended up being destabilizing?
Because, fundamentally, they were often old ideas, or maybe just top-down decrees, applied to this very sophisticated, deeply embedded new cancer. They failed not necessarily because they were bad policy ideas on paper.
And because of the enforcement.
Exactly. Because the integrated elite completely controlled the crucial enforcement apparatus on the ground. Wang Mang could pass a law in the capital decreeing land redistribution. Great. But who was the local official tasked with actually going out and seizing the excess land from Marquis Zhao down the road?
Probably Marquis Zhao's nephew.
Or his son-in-law, or someone who owed him a huge favor. The law was passed, maybe, but it was immediately ignored or sabotaged or just violently resisted in the provinces. The institutional capture was so complete that the law, the emperor's decree, could not penetrate the local power structure.
It just bounced off.
Totally. Land surveys meant to figure out who owned what and maybe tax it fairly. They were falsified. Slave emancipation laws, ignored. The elites simply mobilized their private armies to protect their assets, violently suppressed any official who actually tried to enforce the reforms, which of course led to more instability, more local conflict, even civil war.
It really highlights that observation by the historian Arnold Toynbee, right? That by the later part of the Han Dynasty, the Eastern Han, the whole civilization just seemed to have stopped evolving.
Yeah.
Had no new systems, no new political technology to counter this specific internal form of erosion. It was stuck.
It was a systemic lock-in, a doom loop. The powerful elite controlled all the inputs, the wealth, the political offices, even the dominant ideology, the Confucian interpretation. There was simply no space, no oxygen for genuinely radical new ideas or systems to gain any political traction.
So the final scene, the collapse. When the yellow turbans, those landless peasants, the ultimate victims of this whole predatory system, when they finally rise up and break down the gates.
They weren't attacking a strong, resilient, wealthy government capable of defending itself.
No, they found an empty shell.
That's it. The strong empire had been pronounced dead from total institutional and fiscal capture long before the peasants ever marched on the capital cities. The Han Dynasty didn't fall to foreign invaders. It self-annihilated, consumed from within by the catastrophic success of its own internally generated oligarchy. #tag outro. So, this whole deep dive into the Han Dynasty's self-destruction happening centuries ago, it offers some really clear, honestly chilling lessons about the fundamental relationship between wealth, power, and the stability of a state, even today.
Yeah, you can definitely draw some lines.
We can pull out, I think, 3 really undeniable conclusions about structural risk from this story.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, and this is a big one, prosperity among a select few or even overall macroeconomic growth, like we saw with the Han's agriculture, it does not automatically guarantee a strong or stable state.
Right. If the wealth is just accumulating in private hands, and especially if it's tax exempt.
Exactly. If it's effectively siphoned off into private vaults, the public system, the state, will inevitably become impoverished. It'll weaken, even starve, right in the midst of what looks like national abundance.
Okay, lesson 1. Private wealth doesn't equal public strength if it's not connected. What's number 2?
Second, effective fiscal tools taxes. Basically, they aren't just mechanisms for collecting cash to pay for stuff. They are essential political instruments. They're required to convert private wealth concentration back into national strength into public capacity.
So if the state can't effectively tax the most concentrated forms of capital,
whether that's land in the ancient world or maybe highly financialized assets or corporate profits hidden offshore today. If the state can't tap into that wealth, then public infrastructure, public services, they will inevitably decay until the state simply fails to perform its most basic functions, like protecting its borders or maintaining order.
Makes sense. And the third conclusion.
Finally, and this flows directly from the Han disaster. The burden of taxation, it must be borne primarily by those who have the ability to pay.
The wealthy.
Yes. When the wealthy elite managed to manipulate the system, legally or illegally, to shift the primary tax burden onto the poor, the landless, the wage earners, You create that fatal destructive feedback loop we saw,
Taxing the poor into deeper poverty.
while simultaneously allowing the ultra-rich to establish what amount to private sovereign empires within the nation, hoarding wealth and power. It's a recipe for collapse.
The Han Dynasty really does provide this perfect, terrifying, historical blueprint for how institutional capture works.
It shows exactly how seemingly minor structural policy flaws, like how you collect taxes or who's eligible for office, can be weaponized by a unified, multi-identity elite to achieve not just influence, not just control, but eventually total systemic collapse.
Okay, so that leads us to our final closing challenge for you, our listener, our learner. Imagine you could travel back in time, back to the early Han Dynasty, and you're armed with this knowledge we've just unpacked about zero-cost landholding, about the monetary tax trap, about multi-identity integration. You find yourself as a powerful, maybe ethical minister in the court?
Okay, you have some influence.
What radical new system? Something genuinely new, something beyond just trying to survey the land again or freeing some slaves. What would you implement? What could you possibly do to break that self-perpetuating cycle of the oligarchic elite?
Yeah, what specific foundational measure could possibly restore the state's fiscal health, force some of that hoarded private wealth back into the public system, and actually prevent the death of an empire that still looked strong on the outside?
That's the question. That's the puzzle we leave you to ponder. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.